Hello and welcome to Beneath the Surface, episode 7. Today I'm joined by Matt VanDerVelde, creator of Third Eye Photography and published author of the book Abandoned Asylums, which is a book of photography of many different institutions in Canada and I think also in the US. And most importantly, the childhood babysitter of yours truly.
I've got so much dirt I've been waiting to dish on you. Now's the opportunity.
Yeah, I was actually thinking back. I don't have I was so young back then, but I don't have too many memories. But the one I have two memories. The first one is that when we used to go home, and when I would stay after school at your place, you would always give me Oreos, and me and your little brother would get Oreos, and we would get 2, but you would get 3. So you would take the third one, and I always
remember that.
Yeah, I always kind of resented that. So that was fun.
Hey, you got to respect your elders, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I don't know. Yeah, lay down the law or whatever. So and then the second memory is a little redeeming for you, I suppose. The second one was at the school we went to, Pineview, there was kind of like a big kid play structure.
Yeah.
And I remember one time you invited me to like kind of play on it because I wasn't really supposed to, and one of your friends or someone was like, he's not allowed to be on here, and you were like, nah, he's cool, like he can be on here. So you like came up big for me there. I was like able to play on the big kid play structure.
You owe me one then.
Yeah. And you owe me an Oreo or several.
Boy.
Yeah. So I mean, let's. Actually, before we get started, how can people follow you on Facebook and Twitter and all that? Do you want to give a bit of a plug?
Sure. On Facebook, it's facebook.com/abandonedasylumsbook. I update that pretty regularly with history and photos from the book and photos that didn't make the cut. I'm pretty big on Instagram. That's what I focus most of my attention to. And it's Third Eye Photo, and it's photo with an F. Unfortunately, someone else had the PH, so I had to sound like the illiterate one. So
right. Well, I ran into the same problem with Beneath the Surface. I had to use Bend the Surface.
I saw that.
Yeah.
I thought you had a list for something when
you. Everyone thinks it's a typo, but I'm like, no, it's just that's what. So it happens. It happens.
And then, of course, there's the website, which is abandonedasylums.ca.
Great.
So those are the 3 main outlets for the book. Yeah.
Great. All right, so let's hop into it then. So let's start at the beginning. I mean, what was the inspiration for this book? Say, what were you thinking? Why did you want to do it?
Okay, it's interesting when I go back to, I think it was 2008 or 2009 was my first asylum that I photographed, and it was the one that's in Kingston. It's known as Rockwood Insane Asylum, and it was Canada's first criminal lunatic asylum. So for people who were not only mentally disturbed, but also had a criminal past. And for some reason, I think it's this interesting thing that most people have an innate sort of morbid curiosity to see things that they don't normally get to see. I think that's why we watch the show Cops, or we watch high-speed, police chases, or all these Discovery Channel shows about prisons and this kind of thing. Like, those are usually places that are behind lock and key and not open to public viewing. And so when it came to the asylum, it started out as curiosity. I knew nothing. I just wanted to see the inside and see what these places really were like. And then the more and more I did it, the more curious I became, and the more I wanted to become a voice for their histories. A lot of these places are so decrepit that they're facing the wrecking ball. And since the book's been out, it's been 2 years now, some of the institutions in the book don't even exist anymore, which is kind of sad. So over the years, I've developed almost this weird sort of human connection to them. Like, there is no real visual history for people that's easily accessible. So I figured that at some point these photos would have to be seen by somebody, because it did start out as like a hobby and like something I did on the side for my normal photography work. But then it grew into something even much more important, which I think the book has successfully done. So that's sort of where it began.
Great. So let's talk a bit about. You mentioned the wrecking ball and how some of these institutions are being, or asylums are being destroyed. Like, for me personally, as kind of a disability advocate,
Mm-hmm.
um, I kind of like, I'm kind of like, oh yeah, like these places shouldn't exist. And
Mm-hmm.
but on the other hand, I can understand, like in terms of their architecture and
Exactly.
whatnot, if you had an appreciation for architecture, that you would be kind of interested in those places. So um, I guess, did you have any trouble kind of appreciating the architecture and balancing that with respect for the social ills that were committed in these institutions against the people that live there? I mean, that's an interesting balancing act,
True.
to appreciate it architecturally, and then also understand the pain and suffering that went on inside,
Exactly.
and respecting that. I mean, how did you come to balance those things?
Yeah. Well, to be honest, once you get inside, it's pretty easy to appreciate the efforts that went into these places. To draw a parallel here, and in no way am I comparing, but with the Holocaust, for example, you have Auschwitz, which is still open today as a museum, and there's a reason for that. And I think the old time saying is that if you don't learn from history or study where we went wrong, then you're doomed to repeat it. And I think with asylums and mental health nowadays, it's more than relevant than it's ever been. Um, these places were started out with good intentions, but unfortunately, that's not how they rounded out their existence. They weren't as evil as people think. They operated on the best knowledge of their time, and while some of them do have quote unquote their own horror stories, a lot of them it was just business as usual. And when we talk about the beginnings of the asylum era and the good intentions, we're talking even pre-medicine. So mid 1800s, 1840s is some of the oldest asylums that I visited. And to put that in perspective, like Canada wasn't even a nation at that time. So you can imagine the extent of the knowledge and psychiatric understanding back then. There literally was none. The best idea was that you would take somebody from a city who was suffering from whatever kind of illness, and you would give them fresh air and lots of sunlight and social activities, and that was their road to recovery. These places were built with 16 foot wide hallways. This was to really promote the idea of space and giving people space to recover, and massive windows for lots of sunlight and fresh air. And they were very revolutionary because at this time there was nothing. The asylums did not exist, so it's almost like we're finding people with mental illness in jails and basements of homes. Let's say you had an uncle or an aunt who was suffering from mental illness, you would sort of chain them in the basement, and obviously that is not the way to handle that. So a bunch of reformers came along and realized that we need an institution specifically for the treatment of the mentally ill. And so that's exactly what happened. They created these massive buildings out in the middle of the forest, with like you said, all these ornate fixtures and woodworking and ironwork, and they're just so beautiful that you're drawn into the details when you're inside. But it is easy to sort of turn a blind eye to the histories that they have, but it's something that constantly weighs on you as you're inside. There's people with all kinds of different intentions that go into these asylums. A lot of people think I'm the only one, who wandered out of these places, but you have copper thieves, you have vandals, you have arsonists, people who are there to steal old medical stuff. And those are the ones who, just sort of trample on history and don't respect the struggles of the people who once called that home.
Right. So it is interesting that you say that they were revolutionary at the time, because I guess I think the same thing kind of about group homes today.
Yeah.
Like it was back in the 70s and 80s when people were moving out of the institutions, the group homes were the things that were revolutionary. And then another 20, 30 years later, group homes are still seen as like a kind of outdated, old-fashioned way of doing things that uh, doesn't fully serve the people that live there. And now, like in my personal situation, what it is I'm actually a roommate to somebody that has their own place to themselves. He has a neurological disorder, and I'm a roommate. But it is interesting to see the progression, because if you compare, you know, institutions to jails and almshouses and basements, they actually are revolutionary. But then you compare them to group homes, they are old fashioned and not suited to serve the people that live there. But then if you compare
Exactly.
group homes to kind of a subsidy that helps people have their own place and live individually in a kind of normal community setting, then all of a sudden group homes seem outdated. So it seems like a relative
Exactly.
thing.
It's
Now it's easy to say like, oh, look at these awful places. But when
exactly
you
hindsight.
look at the
Hindsight is 2020, and
yeah
it's funny you say that because my mantra with the book has always been, the book is a representation of how far we've come and how far we have to go, and mental illness, the stigma is still alive as it was even back then. We like to think we've come pretty far, but it doesn't take an expert to walk down any city street and see somebody mentally ill on the street itself. And unfortunately, that's the way the cookie crumbled for these places. They started out with good intentions. They were built at a capacity of say 200 people in a massive 500,000 square foot institution. That's a lot of space for each individual, but as families and society realize that this could become a dumping ground for your family members, etc., where you could just pull up, you can drop them off, and at that point, that's when things started to go awry, and they became almost a human warehouse. And so that was the beginning of the downfall for these asylums. But for the first, 2 or 3 decades, they were advanced for their time. There was architecture as therapy. There was no medicine given. It was literally the architectural design of these buildings was meant to help these people.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, as they became overcrowded and more people got dropped off, you had an institution that started out with a capacity of 200. After 2 or 3 decades, you've already ballooned that to maybe 10 times as big, so 2,000, 3,000. And to put that in perspective, one of the largest asylums in the U.S. is on Staten Island, and it houses 15,000 individuals. That's the largest of its kind in the world. So you can imagine that's basically its own little city. And the book displays every little aspect of asylum life. So you're not just going to see, depressing patient rooms and all this sort of thing. You're going to see bowling alleys. You're going to see swimming pools. You're going to see activity areas, which a lot of people might not ever think you would find in an asylum. And that's the beauty of the book, is that I'm really kind of dispelling the myths, and I'm giving you the history straight up with no sort of like ghost stories or any of that sort of ridiculousness. Like, I wanted to put out a respectable history of these places because, like I said earlier, it's harder and harder for people to find this information if you're not looking at old medical documents or really scouring history books. So I figured now was more than ever the time to get this out there.
Right. So that is interesting. You mentioned kind of the respectable aspect of it. So obviously you put a lot of thought into how you can, as you said, accurately display the history or portray the history without doing damage to the images of people that are mentally ill today. So did you have any guidelines to that, or were you just kind of using your intuition and you kind of felt when when you were being respectful to the people that had lived there, did you just trust that respect was going to come across in your photos, or did you actually have some sort of set of guidelines to help you
Not really.
do that?
I just wanted to make sure that there's nowhere in the book that tells my story. You know what I mean? This is much larger than me. While I do suffer from depression myself, I wanted this book to convey just literally the pure history. So I spent forever, researching, and I'm not a writer myself. It's been a few years since I've been out of university. But I put a lot of effort into the text itself, and I wanted it to be taken seriously. I wanted it to bridge that gap between the scholarly world and the curious world. And luckily, to my benefit, I had Carla Yanni, who is a professor at Rutgers, sign on to provide the foreword. And she gave a really great analytical look at the book and, like I said, bridge that gap. Whereas my text, I wanted to tell the story of these places, and some of them, are pretty dark, and some of them aren't dark, and there's nothing I shy away from. There's no sort of false narrative that I inject into the text. Paranormal stuff really runs rampant nowadays, and I think that's almost detrimental to the cause, because there's nothing I hate more seeing than when I post a photo I get the words creepy or, oh my God, I can only imagine, people change the walls and stuff, but the fact of the matter is that's not true, and all people have to do is read the book for them to see that.
Right. I actually think I may have been guilty of that, because I think I put. No, I mean, it depends how you define scary, but I think I called you a photographer of things scary, and
Yeah.
that's not quite the case, but it depends on, I suppose, what you mean by scary. I mean, I obviously those places aren't haunted or paranormal. I guess when I see them, I do think, man, it would have. I guess I'm scared by what went on inside, not by the idea that the people that receive service there are still there or something. So maybe I'll clarify that in my description of you on I think an Instagram post, which is, when I see those pictures and I say something scary, it's not because of the people that live there. It's because I kind of am particularly sensitive to the social ills that kind of went on there. So exactly. I would like to clarify that, I suppose. And
and we do fear the things that we don't know naturally, right? And I mean, I don't blame people for coming in with that outlook, but by the time they reach the last page of the book, they'll have a different sort of perspective. And to me, I think that brings everything full circle, and that's what I wanted from the get-go. So
good. So did you? So just maybe to focus more on positive things. It's easy to look at these places, and especially since a lot of them are kind of decaying and in ruin, it's hard to see. It's easy to see like the bad stuff and to think very negative things about the institutions here. Did you see any signs of kind of human decency when you were there? I mean, what when we look at a lot of the pictures, I think you think, oh, something bad happened here. Did you ever get a sense of like you saw something and you're like, something good went on here, like something decent went on here?
There's a bunch of moments. Basically, any artwork that you see in the book that adorns the walls of these places was actually painted by the patients themselves. So they actually had the freedoms to decorate their own wards, their rooms that they spent time in. Not necessarily their private rooms, but definitely in the hallways, etc., etc. So as you flip the book, you'll see, a random mural of like a Looney Tunes character or something with some sort of phrase underneath, and that really brings home the human aspect. Like, it's one thing to walk through a building that is just walls and furniture, and you can't really tie it to a human story. But the second you see artwork on the walls or a name on a doorway, etc., that's when it really starts to weigh down on you. But one of the coolest things I found that unfortunately didn't make the book, but I guess if you go to the Facebook page, I guess I should post a photo of it, was in the Kingston Asylum. The very first asylum I did still has one of the most powerful images I think I've taken, and it's hanging from a really ornate lamp up in a community room. There's a heart mobile. So, in public school, you would cut out shapes and you would hang them on a mobile, and this one's made out of, I think, a coat hanger with a bunch of yarn, and what's hanging on there is hearts, red hearts. And to me, like, I didn't break down, but that is just such a powerful thing to stumble upon by accident, because it does take you right back to the day that place closed. And for whatever reason, somebody felt compelled to hang that up there. And I thought that was just so incredible. So you do encounter these certain things, and it could be something as simple as, like a shoe that's on the ground. Like, that was somebody's shoe from that period. Or, a medicine bottle, or, like I said, all the names that you'll encounter, whether it be on beds or on doors. The human aspect is all through these places, and it's not hard to find when you're walking around.
Did you notice a difference between, I guess, kind of just related to that, did you notice a difference between kind of the quality of the institution based on whether it was publicly funded or whether it was kind of a private institution? I mean, I'm not trying to imbue it with any sort of, I'm not trying to be political. I'm just curious. I'm literally curious.
That's actually a great question, because a lot of people don't realize that the majority of these institutions were state-run. But there is one particular institution in the book that's called Craig House, which is actually where Marilyn Monroe sought treatment for her illnesses. And this was basically a Victorian mansion in the foothills of New York, near the Adirondacks, and it's in the middle of nowhere. It's this beautiful Victorian mansion, Gothic styled, and the likes of Jackie Gleason and Marilyn Monroe and Frances Jane Seymour and sorry, not Frances Jane Seymour. What the heck is her name? Jane Fonda's mother and Henry Fonda's wife. It was Fitzgerald, who was the wife of F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby. They all sought treatment there, and the difference between the state-run and the private, if you look at the photos, is pretty incredible. At the private institution for the rich and famous, there are no bars on the windows. You were free to walk the grounds. You had your own private nurse team. I think Marilyn Monroe had like 10 or 11 nurses ready to come to her aid. So this was more of like an escape, let's put it that way, than an institution where you would be under a schedule and all this sort of thing. So the difference is night and day between those places. One place was a human warehouse. The other place, you literally had to pay a fancy penny to be there. And the treatment and the environment in which you were is completely different. So yeah, that was a good question.
The reason I asked it, I had heard it before, so I'm kind of influenced quite a bit by the work of someone named Wolf Wolfensberger. I'm not sure if you've ever come across him in your research at all, but he led a kind of he was responsible for a lot of the closures. He was an academic and anyway, I just heard in an interview one time that he said, yeah, like the private institutions weren't so bad. Like he was like really focused on the state-run institutions, and I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure he was a fan of the private institutions per se, but I think he was really good at acknowledging goodness when he saw it, even in really horrible places. And I think, that just kind of inspired that question that. I was just kind of curious the difference between something that's privately run, kind of as a business, versus something that is state run, where it's provided as a service or an accommodation sort of. Even the mindset, I imagine, in those places would be completely different from the point of view of the staff, right?
Yeah. I mean, they all operated under the same knowledge of the time. They kind of have the same aims, but yeah, they definitely. You had more freedom, let's put it that way. So even though there were no bars on the windows, the place was still ornate. There was still the attention to detail in your environment, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, they all had the same sort of goal. They just went about it in different ways through different eras. So I like to look at them back. And so when I say good intention, that's where I focus most of my interest, just because I'm so fascinated by like how it took such a turn for the worse.
Right.
But yeah, so to put it simply, the asylums, like I said, started out with good intentions, and then became human warehouses, and then the development of medicine came, and then everyone was sort of forced out onto the street. People sort of even believe today that there's a pill for every ill, which might not necessarily be the case. Everyone has different viewpoints on where we are in the state of medicine and psychiatry and all this sort of thing. But yeah, I like to think that it's still an open book. I mean, we like to think we have a proper understanding in the handling of the mentally ill, but we really have no clue right now, and there's no place for them. You know what I mean? So you can go to the doctor, you can get pills, but that doesn't help your situation in your day-to-day life. For the last 2 decades that you've lived out on the street, that does not help you. So the struggle is still there. Yeah.
Okay, so...
Sorry, sometimes I tend to ramble. So.
No, that's okay. I like rambling. So... Yeah, I mean that's so. Let's broaden it out a little bit and talk about kind of, we started at the kind of asylum strategy, and now we're moving towards kind of strategies that we have today. I mean, do you walk into anything today or any place and think I've seen this before? Or do you see any similarities between some of the things we have set up today and what you've seen in the asylums? I mean, some of it I understand would be pretty hard because, like, especially the things in the asylums having to do with kind of, I guess, 20th century medicine or 19th century medicine that hasn't kind of made the cut in terms of making it into modern day medicine. So those images I can, they kind of belong to a former time, but some of the images I saw and think like that looks familiar to me. Like there's things that exist today that kind of look like that. Do you ever get that sense or?
Not really. Like, if anything, I get the sense that that era is lost, especially when it comes to like comparing modern day institutions. I mean, if you walk into a modern day hospital, you're not going to see the ornate fixtures. You're not going to see any handiwork in wood or metal, or the environment is. It's almost like it's void. You know what I mean? They just all they care about is getting the medicine and the treatment. And that's why we've grown to hate hospitals, and because they are very institutional. They're not welcoming. They're not comfortable. Whereas back then, I think if we made institutions nowadays with the same sort of, I don't want to say neglect medicine completely, but take into account the environment itself, because there is a lot of valuable history there. And, there is, while it didn't necessarily fix mental illness back then, it certainly pacified it. I mean, if you take somebody out of a very urban situation where they're suffering from illness and, they're being hampered by work, and this is 1800s United States, and you take them into the woods and this beautiful, it almost looks like a mansion. Like, a lot of people don't realize when they look at exteriors of asylums, they'll be like, oh, that looks like a university, or that looks like a church of sorts. But nope, it's an asylum. So, I mean, I'd love to do a book with no title and just have the exteriors, and just for people to marvel at the architecture itself. And at the last page be like, oh, by the way, you just looked at insane asylums.
Dupe them, yeah.
But in short, I think, that's something that we've sort of, turned our back on. We realized it didn't work, but it definitely would have helped. And the modern day hospitals couldn't be further from those original intentions. So.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what maybe I don't have an appreciation enough of the kind of the detail that went into these places versus, say, something like a hospital. I guess the things that were familiar to me were the hallways of doors and kind of the human warehousing aspect of hospitals, or not so much hospitals, because I think for a lot of hospitals it's kind of a temporary situation, or it's the only time you'll be there in your life. There's something different about hospitals that make them okay to me. I don't know what it is, but I really don't like nursing homes and retirement homes. That's something that that human warehousing aspect, I just, it seems to still exist in kind of, especially I suppose the same thing, state-run nursing homes and
it does for sure.
State-run retirement homes. And
there's families, who have individuals struggling with dementia or whatnot, and they might not feel comfortable, even visiting with them, so they just sort of leave them there to live out their final days. And to me, that is so heartbreaking. That shows that we've learned nothing in the last 200 years, because the current state of, like you say, the old age homes is no different than an asylum back in the day when you think about it.
Right.
They don't have the freedoms. They don't have necessarily the proper care, and they're just sort of existing. Like, that's it. They get their meals, they get their clothes changed, but I mean, it's not a pleasant place. It's not a happy place.
Right.
So I think you've hit on a good issue there. And again, going back to the fact that we still have a long ways to go, whether it be in the treatment of the mentally ill or the old.
Right. I guess. So I guess that was the part that was familiar to me. I wasn't so much talking about the details of the architecture, because, quite frankly, you're right. If that much detail and work, that's the one thing the institutions can kind of be held up for, was that yes, a lot of money was put into them, and a lot of care and dedication were put into the architectural aspects of it, based on the knowledge of the medicine at the time. But today you don't quite see the same thing, and also the bad things about the institutions were carried forward, that they're basically warehouses for people, right? So it's like maybe we've actually gotten a little worse on that issue, which is we still have the warehousing, but without the nice architecture.
This is true, exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously, if it had those details, you would walk in there and you would notice them, and you would be like, wow, Grandma, you're going to this really beautiful place. But if you go to any old age home nowadays, find me a place that has the same amount of detail and effort put into the physical environment as these old asylum towns, you will not find them. And that's tragic, unfortunately.
Well, and the physical environment or setting of a place does change the way you think about the people living there. I mean, there's no doubt about that. So yeah, that's interesting. So I guess are there other aspects of, we just kind of nailed something negative maybe, which is that we still seem to warehouse people in a way that without the nice architecture even. Sorry, my phone's buzzing here like mad. I'm hoping that's not going to come through in the podcast too much, but um, so yeah, we just kind of nailed something negative there. Do you see any strides that we've made in the treatment of people that are mentally ill? I mean, where's a good aspect where we've made some progress that do you think? Is there somewhere that we as a society has improved?
I mean, medicine helps for sure. It's definitely a step in the right direction, but there's still a lot of debate as to the damages that we're doing, or whether it makes you a vegetable, like whether the version of you healthy on medication is the same version of you as you would be healthy without it. You know what I mean? There's that debate between vaccines and drugs, and I don't know if we have it figured out, or like what sort of positive direction we're going. It seems almost like a stagnant sort of solution, like, oh, we just have medicine, so we'll give you all the pills you need, and it's up to you to take them. But if you know what I mean, if you don't take them, then that's on you, sort of deal. So I don't really see too many positives, to be honest. Like I said earlier, mental illness is still just as stigmatized as it used to be. So I don't really have the answer, to be honest. I don't have the solution. I can only speak on the history and where we've come. But I do hope it gets sorted out. I do hope more and more attention is brought to it, because it's almost epidemic-wise nowadays with the amount of people who are being lost to suicide. And it really is a sad time.
Right. That's interesting that you say that, because I kind of hold the same opinion that even if we have made progress, which I don't think we have, but even if we did, we haven't made as much as people think we do or would like to think we have. So you're actually probably one of the first people I've talked to that actually thinks the same thing. So that's I'm kind of, I feel a little validated, to be honest, in that opinion.
I mean,
so
and medicine is only half the battle, right? Like, there's a reason these people are on the streets, because they can't look after themselves. So I mean, steps the government could take to help mental health, although not directly related, but I mean, imagine like a national public housing strategy where everybody has a roof over their heads, regardless of how much you make. I think that would be a great place to start, tackling the issue that we have nowadays. And then maybe not so much turn them into homes, but, have like, one nurse for each floor or someone that can just, do a daily check to make sure everyone's fine and they're not doing drugs, so they shouldn't be doing, et cetera, et cetera. But still have the freedom, you know what I mean, to come and go as you want. I think that's sort of a compromise, but that's not where we're at currently. So, yeah.
It's hard to imagine a case where mental illness could be treated and helped without someone having a roof over their head. That's a pretty good place to start. I would agree. It's just how to do that without, because I think you're right in that, the roof over the head is the place to start, and then how do you architecturally figure out something so that the human warehousing thing doesn't kick into action again, right? Because just like the people that built the institutions, they weren't intending that they were going to turn into these warehouses. They just did, and it was unintended. So I guess, to be able to provide a roof for someone, and then also prevent the kind of slippery slope of human warehousing beginning again, and safeguarding against that. And if we had the answer to that, I suppose we'd have high-paying jobs in solving world problems, I suppose. But exactly. It certainly is a difficult issue to try and figure out. Okay, so let's see where I want to go. All right, I'll go here. I'm not sure if this might be a weird place to go, but we're gonna go here
Okay.
anyway.
Yeah.
You mentioned a lot. There's a whole section in the book about Walter Frazier.
Walter
That was
Freeman.
Freeman. Sorry, Walter
Yeah.
Freeman, kind of the father of the lobotomy.
Yeah.
You mentioned these drugs, kind of the pharmaceuticals or the medical model of mental illness. Like do you see, like, the one thing I was thinking was I kind of saw a connection between the goal of the lobotomy and the goal of kind of some of these pharmaceutical drugs, which is just to kind of placate people and make them easier to handle. Do you see that connection or no? Do you see?
Well, if you look at the history, Freeman is an interesting character. So you'll be introduced to a few interesting characters in the text of the book. But he was a doctor who believed mental illness to be a physical defect in the human brain. So he completely failed in his studies because we now know that it's not a physical defect. He exhumed the brains of many of his patients, obviously after they had passed away, and he compared them and he weighed them and he studied them, and unfortunately it was all for nil. But his fatal flaw was that he almost wanted to be celebrated as the curer of mental illness. So he actually believed, there was an end game to mental illness. And I'm not necessarily sure that there is, to be honest. So maybe pacifying symptoms is the only way to do it. But he was interesting in the fact that, like I said, he believed it was a physical defect. There was another doctor, another hospital who believed it was through infection. So you can see during this time, like, we really had no clue, and every doctor was sort of going off in their own direction and doing whatever they felt like. But the sad thing about Dr. Freeman is that in the process, he botched many lobotomies, and the lobotomy itself proved to be ineffective. There were patients where he would have to perform multiple lobotomies on, because he would do the procedure, and 6 months later they would fall back into their usual self. I don't want to say usual self, but you know what I'm getting at here.
Mm-hmm.
And then he would have to go in and do it again. So I mean, his whole framework was completely flawed. But he is an important character because it is a chapter in the history. But unfortunately, it came at the suffering of the people that were under his ice pick, as he liked to call it. But yeah, that it's hard to tell, because, like I said, hindsight is 20/20. So at the time, he was actually very much revered, and people believed, he was really onto something. But in the end, that wasn't the case. So I mean, even nowadays, we still can't be too sure that what we're doing is the right thing, or will eventually lead to that cure that has eluded so many others.
That's interesting you say that, because that was going to be my next question. I mean, is there anything we're doing today that you think in 100 years time is going to be seen as like, oh, that was really primitive or morally corrupt, or even though today it's kind of seen as the norm or the
I'd like to think that we look back on the asylum era as being terrible and inhumane, because we locked all these people up. But now we almost have the opposite problem, where we're doing nothing and they're just wandering the streets. I mean, isn't that equally as inhumane? You know what I mean?
Right.
So it's hard to say, to be honest.
Well, it is interesting you say that, because so Wolfensberger, who I brought up earlier, he lamented the fact that a lot of people, kind of the kind of ideology of the day was inclusion and integration. And what a lot of people did was just dump people and then not provide any support for them. Sometimes in New York in their pajamas in the middle of winter, and say, okay, you're included now, you're integrated.
And you can say people are still doing that nowadays.
Yeah,
there's so many homeless on the streets of Ottawa or any other major city.
Yeah.
They're right there in the open. We walk by them, we deny them. Like, we almost feel that they should just be removed, or they should be hidden, because they're pestering us, asking us for quarters. So we don't look at the bigger picture. We look at them as an annoyance, and like I said, stigma is still alive and well, so it's just going to spiral out from there.
Right. It's interesting that you're picking up on the same thing, where like even for someone like me that kind of has been raised to absolutely detest the institutional model. On the other hand, I certainly wouldn't advocate for putting people out in the middle of winter in their pajamas,
Exactly.
and am certainly willing to acknowledge that maybe the institution would have been better for them, even though those are morally corrupt places, than New York in the middle of winter in their pajamas. Sometimes it's the least worst option for
Yeah.
people, but I definitely don't don't want the institutional model to come back and be the norm, even to the extent that it's the norm today.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, let's talk a little bit about and maybe you don't have kind of the history on this because it's
Mhm.
maybe a bit of an obscure question, but the word mentally ill. I mean, was it used back in the era of Walter Freeman, or is that kind of a anachronistic term that
This
we've kind of
this is
projected
yeah. This
backwards?
is, the word mentally ill is definitely the politically correct um, vocabulary that we use today. But back in the day, there was, you were an idiot. That's a mental illness. Idiocy.
Right.
We use that R word that I don't even want to say it, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So even throughout all these years, like there's been words that have been dropped, there's been words that have been used. So in the book, I tend to use them by the names that they were called when they were created, because, like I said, I'm doing an analysis of their history. So I want to take us back and put us in that context. But through most of the asylum era, eventually they all became what is just simply a state hospital. So you would have, New York City State Hospital or Boston State Hospital or this kind of thing, whereas they had much more creative names when they began. You would have Hudson River State Hospital for the insane, or for the chronic, or all kinds
Infirm,
of
I've
different.
heard a lot too. Infirm or
Exactly,
yeah.
yeah. The majority of these people work in chronic, and they did spend most of their lives institutionalized, which is pretty sad. There's one story in the book. Her name is Audrey Munson, and she's known as New York City's first supermodel. And I use the word supermodel lightly here because, like I said, we're back in the Victorian era, so you can imagine
what a
what the
supermodel looks
fashion
like back then. Yeah.
supermodels would look like. But basically, all the statues and busts in New York City were modeled after her. She was deemed to be so perfectly beautiful in her dimensions that every sculptor and artist wanted to use her. So if you go through New York City today, you'll see her face on buildings, on statues at the entrance of Central Park, at the base of the Manhattan Bridge. There's statues of her. And she had a successful life up until a doctor friend who wanted to be with her, who was obviously deranged. He murdered his wife. And she ended up getting tied up into this whole situation, even though she had nothing to do with it. And she developed symptoms of depression. And she was institutionalized at St. Lawrence State Hospital, which is just across the river from us. And she lived to 104, but she was incarcerated some almost 70 years. So that sort of aspect is really heartbreaking. I wanted to tell those stories because the unfortunate notion is that if there was anything that you exhibited that would set you apart from the norm back then, you could be institutionalized. And so I like to draw that parallel to me. Like, I have depression, so imagine me back then. Like, that could have been me. You know what I mean? I could be institutionalized for my entire life. Whereas nowadays, I have the freedoms to handle the illness the way that I want to, and do the activities that I love, which I do think help me and my own story. But back then, people did not have those freedoms. And there's all kinds of stories in this book that I wanted to convey, because it's like I end the book, for instance, on the cemeteries. A lot of people don't realize, like I was saying earlier, that you would spend your entire life there. So when you passed, there'd be no one there to pick you up, because your family would never come visit, let alone want anything to do with you. And some of those cemeteries, the biggest one I went to, has 10,000 people buried in numbered graves. So the only thing that's on your tombstone is a number. And unfortunately, all the paperwork for those tombstones is usually still in the asylum. So, I mean, a lot of these people are forgotten in time. You may have, a long-lost family member who was there, and you would never know it if you wanted to do that research. So I wanted to end the book on those cemeteries, because that is the most powerful human emotion you can feel. Is that by the time you reach the end of the book, you realize, holy cow, although there are no people in my book, those tombstones speak for themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. That's powerful. That these people spent their entire lives there,
Exactly.
and were kind of abandoned by their families.
First they were abandoned. Yeah, first they were abandoned by their families, and then they were abandoned by the government. For that, I don't think there's any excuse. I mean, you shut down an institution, but yet you can't pay somebody, a few bucks to cut the grass at the cemetery. You know what I mean? So a lot of these cemeteries, you'll have trees that are, 6-inch stumps growing up through a grave, and nothing's being done, and headstones are being toppled over due to tree roots, and it's just a sad situation.
I've also heard too, like, of instances where these graves will actually be completely demolished because the worst I've heard is that the grave sites would be demolished because they were an inconvenience to the caretaker, like mowing the lawn.
Yeah.
So that they were just basically removed so that it would be easier to mow the grass. So I've heard of that kind of thing too.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and yeah, I mean, as someone that, and we'll talk a little bit about what fits into the definition of mental illness here in a second. But as someone that kind of is a disability advocate in my personal life and then also professionally, yeah, it's hard to imagine that, yes, these are the places that people would have been, the people that I know, would have lived, and they would have been completely identityless.
Exactly.
No one would have remembered them. No one would have came to their funeral, if they even had a funeral, yeah, I totally sympathize with the graveyard imagery, and so yeah, if you know anyone even with any sort of difference that would have institutionalized them when back in that time period, yeah, it's really powerful, those gravestone images. I would actually recommend there's a great book called Never Going Back, and it's by a guy named Gord Ferguson. And he was institutionalized in the Rideau Regional Center, which is in Smith Falls.
Yeah.
And he got out, actually. He tried to escape like 11 times, and he got out eventually.
Wow.
And, he had all sorts of horrible things happen to him. But he got out and, like, got married and had this whole other life. And he obviously saw a connection between the nursing homes and the institutions, because his mother always wanted him to go to a nursing home once he got out, and he fought really hard to stay out of that place, and that was the kind of the purpose of the book, was never going back. I'm never going back to the institutional model. It's a very short book, but it's really good. Unfortunately, he's passed away since then. He had cancer. He passed away a couple months ago. Wow. But I would highly recommend that book.
Check that out. Yeah.
For you. And to anyone listening. So let's just talk a little bit about. I won't keep you too much longer, but like when we say mentally ill, that seems to have a certain. Like there seems to be certain conditions that fit in with mentally ill, and then there's certain things that are like so-called disabilities or something like that don't really. Like when we say mentally ill today, we think of things like depression, like anxiety, like schizophrenia or things like that. Whereas like something like, we wouldn't say someone with Down syndrome is mentally ill. They have like a disability. No. Or someone that's autistic isn't mentally ill. They have a disability. Exactly. So I guess I don't know. What do you think of that? I mean, that's kind of curious to me.
Well, nowadays we understand that different illnesses or different disabilities need different treatments, right? Whereas back then, there was just the asylum. There were institutions for children. There were institutions for people that they think progress, and there were institutions for people who spent their entire lives there, the chronic cases. So nowadays, I think it's more, there's so many more groups of individuals who get specialized treatment. You know what I mean? Like somebody who is developmentally disabled or physically disabled, they wouldn't require the same treatment as somebody who has schizophrenia or someone who is battling a bad depression. Right? So I think nowadays we've sort of focused in on the special needs. I'm not using that term in the context that you think I am, but the particular needs of each and every illness, because they are all different and they all do require different things. Whereas back then, like I said, when it all started, everybody was just sort of put into this melting pot, and you just hope for the best. But going back to that, like talking about the children, etc., that was some of the hardest institutions I've had to photograph, because there is no way you can put that on the back of your mind that you're walking through the aisles and through the hallways and you're seeing children's toys. And I mean, that is just heartbreaking. Like, it's one thing for an adult to go through what they went through, but to have a child who really has no understanding or no idea of what's going on, I think that's completely heartbreaking. So the book is an emotional roller coaster, and it is hard for me as the author of the book to balance between saying that, you know, these were good intentioned places, but yet this is how they turn. So, I mean, the histories is always something I'm battling with, and you want to show them in a good light, but it's impossible to do without the bad, and vice versa. And I think a lot of the history is very one-sided, and nowadays you do have that sort of pop culture horror aspect of it, where everybody wants the ghost stories, everybody wants all this stuff. But I hate to say it to the listeners, but in all the asylums I've done, I haven't had a ghost encounter. I haven't seen a ghost, and that's not what I'm in there to do. I'm in there to document the history. As dark as it could be, as happy as it could be, I'm there to do a job, right? So, yeah.
Well, it might say more about you and the person in the asylum than it does say about the asylum. You know, like if you go in there thinking that you're gonna find ghosts and stuff, I mean, what does that say about your opinion about what mental illness is? You know,
Exactly.
versus
you're automatically coming. You're pretty much feeling the fire that stigma lives off of, right? Like if let's say this book was about ghost stories and stuff, then I would be promoting fear to the masses, that people should fear these places, but that really is not the case at all. So it is a history that you have to be careful with. And the whole ghost thing, I really don't understand. I mean, you have there's a place in the book that's called Penhurst, and that was one of those institutions for children, and it has one of the darkest histories, institutional histories in the United States, and it was forced closed. And nowadays they host a horror event in their administration building, completely tone deaf to the history of the suffering there. And I mean, that kind of thing you just cannot support. Like, they do a booming business. They bring in thousands of people every Halloween. And I'd like to walk through there and just interview the people and be like, you do realize that you're basically on sacred ground. Like, children died here. Children were force fed until they had food in their lungs and died of respiratory pneumonia. But that's just not on their mind. They just want to see a ghost. You know what I mean? So I think there's still a lot of respect that these places need to be shown. And unfortunately, they aren't getting it. So I'm hoping that the book takes the readers in that direction, and they can form whatever conclusion they want, just as long as they're informed. You know, like, all I want to do is history into people's hands, and they can form whatever opinion they want based on what I've written. So that's been the goal of the book.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's a very admirable goal. So the book is called Abandoned Asylums. Where can people buy it, Matt?
So it's available through all major retailers, Amazon throughout the world. It's actually on sale with free shipping if you do Amazon. I think it might be the same for chapters in India and Canada. In the United States, Barnes & Noble. So basically, if you just go to the website, I've got links to all the different retailers, or you can just do a search on Amazon for Abandoned Asylums, and it should pop up.
Okay, great. So I don't want to leave it. We were kind of pretty negative there at the end. Let's leave it on a high note. Okay. You know, what was kind of we talked a little bit about human decency. What is there one particular thing? I mean, you mentioned a few, but what stood out to you as kind of? Is there something in particular that stood out to you that was particularly decent, or that something good went on here?
To be honest, one of the things about the book is that it's introduced me to the masses, and I've had the opportunity to speak with the nurses who worked in these places, and they're not evil people. I've always said that the understanding of these places is that they were evil institutions run by evil administration, but that's not the case at all. I had people reach out to me that worked there for 30 years, and they had nothing bad to say whatsoever. And that's in hindsight. That's in 2018. So you'd think if somebody worked there in the 70s and it was as bad as we like to think it was, they would have something bad to say. But fortunately for me, it's been all positive. So now I'm not denying the struggles. I'm not denying that there were some bad apples. But like you said, it's important that we take it both with the positive and the negative, because it was not all negative. These people, this was their entire life was stationed on these properties. They had everything they needed. They produced their own food. They worked in the farms. They had a pool. They had a recreation hall where you could play bowling or pool or all kinds of stuff. So, I mean, it was not always as bad as we think it was. So if we ended on anything, that's the best way to end it, I think.
Okay. Yeah, I'll and I should clarify about the when I say things about nursing homes too, or retirement homes, I should clarify and say the same thing, that I'm not ripping on nurses or PSWs. Some things are bad models and are outside the control of any one individual, and so I would echo that and say that. I think the same thing about nurses today, that most of them are good people. There may be a few bad apples, but the problem is not with the people, it's with the model sometimes. And I suspect the same thing about the institutions back in the institutions that are pictured in your book. It's not the people that were working there, it's the model,
Exactly. It starts at the top and it works its way down. And anybody that's evil is going to be evil regardless, but that wasn't the case for every institution. So, but yeah, like in terms of my experience, it's been an incredible adventure. I mean, I'm a curious individual, but I can also respect the history. But there is a bit of adventure not knowing what you're gonna find in these places, because I'm literally going in there with very little information. I might have an aerial photograph that shows me where the buildings are, but it's incredibly hard to find the paperwork regarding these places. What was done in this room, or what was done in this building? A lot of it's known, but there's still a lot of unanswered questions. So it is fun, while respecting history. It is fun for me, and it is almost therapeutic as well, because, like I said, I myself suffer from depression. So just me seeing firsthand how far we've come, it puts me at ease. You know what I mean? It makes me feel better about my illness, and it doesn't make me feel so alien, because these are no longer the times in which we live. So it's been a great experience.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Matt.
That wasn't really your question.
That's all right. No, that's a good way to end. So thank you, Matt, for speaking with me. For the people listening, I just wanted to remind you that you can follow me on Twitter and Facebook, and on Instagram. My handle for Twitter and Instagram is at Ben the Surface. Beneath the Surface was taken, as we lamented at the beginning. So I would encourage you to check out those sites. That's kind of where I keep everything updated, and let everyone know about upcoming episodes and who my next guests are, and that sort of thing. The other thing is, if you want to support me on Patreon, I would encourage you to do that if you like the content. So the link for that will be in the description here. So again, Matt. I don't know if you still go by Matthew or not, Matt. That was me channeling my childhood there. Thank you again for speaking with me. It was a great, enlightening discussion. I would encourage everyone to go out and rapidly buy your books up. Yeah, it's a great read. Lots of great photography in there. You're incredibly talented. And if the abandoned asylums don't sell you, I should also mention that you take a lot of photos of very attractive women. So, so if nothing else, you can go check out Matt's work for that as well. So,
Yeah.
So, okay. Thanks again, Matt, and I'll talk to you later.
No problem. I'll have to mail you some Oreos.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks so much for having me, Hayden.
Yeah. Talk to you later.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.